Hi, I'm John. How are you? I was feeling curious a few months ago. I went to the internet and typed in 1968. There's a lot to know about that year, 1968. A lot went on that year. My history classes called it a turning point. I found this long list of all these things that happened in 1968. I see this. March 1968, the Congress of the United States repeals the requirement for a gold reserve to back U.S. currency. Okay, the gold standard. I felt the scary thrill of an unfamiliar subject, but I sensed this was something worth knowing. I went looking for the story. What is the gold standard?
The gold standard is whenever a country backs its paper money with gold, where the paper money is literally an explicit promise that if you bring in this paper money to some government institution, they'll hand over gold.
What's the goal behind making sure that money is redeemable in gold?
It puts a limit on how much money the government can create. If they basically have to be able to, you always have to worry about what if everyone comes in at the same time and asks for their gold.
So if a government is printing paper money, a gold standard motivates the government to print as little as possible. But why worry about how much paper money a government prints? And why gold of all things to comfort us that this won't happen? To figure that out, I needed to learn where the gold standard came from. It turns out that practically every world culture has valued gold. It's beautiful, rare, impossible to counterfeit, and it doesn't rust or wear away. Around 600 BCE, the Lydians shaped gold into the first gold coins. For thousands of years afterward, gold coins were the basis of monetary systems around the world. Do you know much about how paper money replaced metal money in our civilization?
It all happened in very gradual natural steps. You can carry gold around to pay for things, but you still have to worry about losing it. So one of the things that happened maybe in the Middle Ages around then, where there were started to be holders of your gold. There'd be some guy with a nice strong safe or something like that. He would hold your gold for you, and he would give you pieces of paper that gave you the right to go in and get your gold. It was like a receipt, and then the receipts started trading instead of the gold. Well, then those guys started to figure out they could just start printing receipts. They could make loans where they would just give people receipts and say, now you give me some gold later. So they started doing fractional reserve banking. And then eventually government saw that this was a very profitable business to be in, and they kind of took it over.
The European governments took over printing paper money by setting up central banks. The first central bank was the Bank of England, established in 1694. When the king spent the Bank of England's money, it wound up in the public. National paper money. Like anything, money is affected by supply and demand. So if there's too much paper money available, its value tends to drop. Money won't buy what it used to. This is called inflation. Some countries have printed so much money that it ends up worthless. So the central banks came up with the gold standard to calm fears of inflation. If they printed too much paper money, they risked having their precious gold reserves cleaned out. Now the 20th century dawns. Every major country, including the U.S., is on the gold standard. But by 1971, none of them would be. World War I began a chain reaction that resulted in the end of the gold standard. To pay for that huge war, central banks printed unprecedented sums of paper money, so much that they couldn't redeem it all for gold. Every nation suspended their gold standard. After the war, the money supply continued to swell to pay for expenditures such as the massive welfare system to care for the wounded soldiers. Fearing inflation, Great Britain finally returned to the gold standard in 1925. To limit new paper money, the Bank of England hiked interest rates, making loans more expensive to obtain. Businesses needed loans to pay their workers. Many now couldn't get loans. Unemployment exploded. To help Great Britain, U.S. banks made their loans easier to get, but many borrowed too much and used the money for high-risk investments, and that contributed to the stock market crash of 1929. The Great Crash led to the Great Depression, which led to the election of the inspiring Franklin Delano Roosevelt as U.S. President. Roosevelt set the new official U.S. gold standard price, $35 per ounce. In 1931, Great Britain dropped back off the gold standard while the U.S. held on. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini were creating fears that there would be another war. European governments sold tons of gold to the U.S. for safekeeping across the ocean and took away dollars to trade back later. By 1939, the U.S. held around 75% of the world's gold. That year, World War II erupted, and when it was over 6 years later, Europe and East Asia were in ruins. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the Allied nations planned how to restart the world economy. The U.S., with no war damage and 3/4 of the world's gold wealth, was the choice to anchor the new system. U.S. dollars would be adopted for international transactions, but governments could still get gold from the U.S. at $35 per ounce. But soon gold was leaving the U.S. as investment in foreign companies. At the same time, the Cold War began, and the U.S. printed more dollars to pay for a ballooning military budget. More dollars and less gold. On February 4, 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle held a press conference. Dollars were increasing, and the U.S. now only had 50% of the world's gold to back them. De Gaulle declared it a threat to the whole system and insisted countries stop trading with dollars. He announced that the French government would redeem its dollars and take back the gold. Many shared de Gaulle's skepticism. Betting that the dollar wouldn't last as international money, more and more speculators sought an alternative. Many bought raw bullion gold on the London Gold Exchange. Traditionally, bullion gold was cheaper than monetary gold, but the increased demand brought the high price. Thinking they could head this off, the U.S. and several European countries created the gold pool. The gold pool countries quietly monitored the London Exchange. If the bullion price neared $35 per ounce, they sold some of their own gold reserves on the exchange. By increasing the amount of gold on the market, they forced the price back down.
The only problem with the gold pool is there's only so much gold they had on reserve. It's very hard to maintain on a fractional reserve system. A dollar was a promise for the government of the United States to deliver a certain amount of gold, because just the mere fact that people start to think that you might give up causes them to want to come and redeem their coupons. The rate of outflow of the gold got to be more than we thought was sustainable.
So what happened in 1968? The gold pool countries gave up. They stopped selling gold on the London Gold Exchange. It was a tactic to protect their gold reserves, and it was an admission that dollar levels had gone too high to defend. After 1968, as the price of bullion steadily rose to record levels, what was to stop a country from buying U.S. gold at $35 per ounce, melting it down, selling it on the London Bullion Exchange at a higher price, returning to the U.S. with all those new dollars, and simply repeating the process? Only 3 years later, President Richard Nixon took the final step. As France and other nations sought to turn in their dollars for gold, Nixon outlawed the sale of national gold reserves. No more gold standard. 1968 was a historic year. In politics and culture, America seemed to enter a new era. Though rarely front-page news, the money system entered a new era of its own. This is the first period since the ancient Lydians that gold is not the basis of the monetary system. How does this affect us today? Well, the famous inflation of the 1970s is connected to the end of the gold standard. Many at the time feared for the dollar's survival without a gold standard behind it, so the dollar's exchange rate plunged. Were we better off during the gold standard? The paper money supply is no longer limited by the supply of gold, and inflation is a very real danger. But many useful government services are not possible with the limited financial resources under a gold standard. The constant need to pay increasing prices for oil also gets in the way. One could argue that maybe there isn't enough gold to pay for everything that a modern civilization requires. Or maybe any system is just what we make of it. I want you to make up your own mind. Get the knowledge. That's the first step. About anything. This has really been just an example. Browse the internet, read books, then read them again, make friends with professors, get your questions answered, and enjoy the hunt.